Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this ASI webinar on assessing human rights impact assessments under criterion 2.5 of the ASI Performance Standard. I'm really excited to be here today with Kendyl Salcito, who's the Executive Director of Nomogaia and a member of the ASI Standards Committee, as well as a supporter of the ASI Human Rights Working Group. She has worked at mining, processing, and manufacturing facilities as a human rights impact assessor on 4 continents, or 5 if you count Indonesia as part of Australia Pacific. And she's also co-authored one of the leading methodologies for human rights impact assessments and collaborates closely with practitioners and experts in the field to implement best practices in HRIA worldwide. I'll also add, though this is not part of her official bio, that she's an incredible, wonderful, and professional person to work with. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Kendyl.
Thanks very, very much for that intro, Krista. Again, thank you all so much for being here. I'm delighted to be talking about HRIA. It's something that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm incredibly impressed with ASI for its commitment to human rights in its standards and to its member companies for being committed to high standards for performance. On slide 2, the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative Performance Standard Criterion 2.5 addresses impact assessment, and it requires entities to conduct an array of assessments, including human rights impact assessment. And this particular webinar focuses on human rights impact assessment because it is similar to other impact assessments, but it's also distinct. So slide 3, what is impact assessment? There are ways in which an HRIA is closely aligned with the traditional suite of IAs. It flags actual and potential impacts both. It can be used on an array of operations or policies, and it is evidence-based. So given these similarities, slide 4, why do we need to talk about this? Human rights, unlike environmental conditions or economic conditions, benchmarks against a very different set of criteria using very different sources of data. HRIA methodology is not yet as clearly defined as ESIA is. ESIA has been around since the 1960s and 70s. Human rights impact assessment for corporate operations really has its genesis in sort of the time frame between 2005 and 2015. So it's a much newer assessment. And human rights are inherently harder to measure than, for example, water quality or air emissions. And because these documents can be controversial, and we want to eliminate any risk of confusion for the auditors who are asked to evaluate them, this webinar aims to just clarify some key components. So slide 5, what is human rights impact assessment? Even though HRIA is distinct from ESIA, it's not wholly divorced from it. A legitimate HRIA will use the content of ESIA as a source of data on environmental and social conditions, supplementing it with additional data. It also uses EIA methodologies as a framework, systematically considering parameters and indicators and triangulating inputs to provide an evidence base for conclusions. But importantly, it goes beyond consideration of the, quote, stakeholders that are so familiar in EIA to also consider rights holders. Slide 6 looks at the distinction between stakeholders and rights holders that's so critical to HRIA. Stakeholder engagement is a well-established concept. Stakeholder mapping identifies the power players and articulates their diverse interests. Stakeholders include corporate managers, investors, government authorities, alongside activist groups and community leaders and locally based experts. Rights holders are different, but they provide a critical and additional perspective. They're not leaders, they're not authorities, they're not power brokers. On the contrary, they're often the least involved in decision making, which means that their only stake in the entity under investigation or assessment is whether it will or will not respect their rights. They're low-level employees and contractors. They're the spouses of workers, the children and elderly people. They include impoverished and uneducated and socially stigmatized people. In essence, they're the people that are never considered, quote, important or key in some of the major impact assessments that exist. So next slide. bearing in mind that an HRIA requires different processes, interviews, and content than a traditional impact assessment, a great question is, how do we audit it? Nomogaia and ASI have created a flowchart to document the process of auditing whether an entity has conducted an HRIA, and we'll get into that shortly. It starts with two extremely basic questions. First, does the company say it has an HRIA? And second, was that document created based on a methodology that uses human rights as its framework? And we care whether the methodology is human rights framed because companies have, in some cases, renamed old assessments human rights assessments just because they touch on a particular right. And that's not enough to pass muster for ASI. But if a company hands an auditor a document that is expressly framed by human rights, there are some follow-up criteria. The next slide is drawn from work conducted by the Danish Institute for Human Rights, which has produced some of the most acclaimed guidance on HRIA. And they've set forth 10 key criteria for HIA. For the purposes of ASI audits, these can be condensed into sort of 5 key components. First, does it directly engage diverse rights holders? Second, does it cover all human rights and relevant business relationships? So, for example, does it include the port if the company is the primary user of that port? 3, does it include feedback with affected populations? 4, does it rate impacts by severity? And 5, does it prioritize interventions based on that severity rating? On the next slide, it's intuitive that an HRIA that demonstrates all 5 of these components is a success. It fully conforms with ASI expectations and international good practice. But what if the HRIA covers some of the criteria, not all? So on the next slide, you see the reality is you simply don't have a legitimate HRIA if it doesn't involve interviews with rights holders and doesn't cover all human rights. These first 2 criteria are critical, and if an HRIA is missing those 2, it is a failed HRIA, as the next slide emphasizes. And the sort of corollary reality to this in the next slide is that it isn't really possible to have the last 3 criteria if you don't have the first 2. It's not possible to have feedback with rights holders if you didn't interview them to begin with, and it doesn't really matter how you rate your human rights impacts if the company didn't consider the full suite of rights to begin with. So skipping forward to a minor failure, there are situations where if you receive an HRIA that is participatory and inclusive of the full suite of rights, there are ways for the company under audit to repair that HRIA. If any or all of those last 3 components are missing, the entity can have its human rights team return to the field for consultation, revisit findings to rate impacts, or reorganize its management plan to prioritize impacts by the severity of impact. The absence of any of these 3 components is fixable. Our next slide is a flowchart that essentially covers the content of these major failure, minor failure, conformance process. It starts with this basic question in the top left corner: is there a document called HRIA, Human Rights Assessment, Human Rights Risk Assessment? If not, but the entity under audit says there's an ESIA chapter or there's a labor risk assessment, then the auditor can ask, does it include a description of the methodology for directly assessing the full suite of impacts on human rights? And if not, that is a major failure. But if so, then you can look into the actual content of the assessment for audit, whether it engages rights holders, whether it's appropriately scoped. And if yes to those and it meets the following 3 criteria, you have a fully conforming HRIA. And your work as an auditor is thorough and complete and successful. Now, there are implications for ASI certification that Krista's going to talk about, so I will let her take over from here.
I'll just jump in for a couple of minutes. Those of you auditors who are on the line maybe picked up that we're talking about failures versus non-conformances. And the reason for that is that criterion 2.5 deals with 3 different impact assessments in the one criteria. So we have the HRIA, but we also have an environmental impact assessment and a social impact assessment. So what we're going to go through in the next few slides here is how we take this finding of determination in specific just to the HRIA and come up with a finding for the entire criterion. So when looking at conformance for 2.5, you have to add the finding that you have for the HRIA assessment that we've just talked about, and look at it along with the other criterions as well. The first outcome, and then working in kind of reverse order to what it was presented, but if you have a minor failure in the HRIA, so that's those last three components that Kendyl was speaking about, if you have a minor failure there, and you either have full conformance or a minor failure of the environmental and social impact assessment, this would likely result in a minor non-conformance. And as always, you, the auditors, must use your judgment in terms of determining this, but the intended outcome is that if you have a minor failure in an HRIA and minor failures elsewhere, that this would likely be a minor non-conformance, unless you determine that collectively there's a major non-conformance. But our guidance is that a minor in the HRIA, a minor failure there, along with either a conformance or minor failure in the environmental and social impacts, would result in a minor non-conformance. Now, if you had a major failure in the HRA and then full conformance of the environmental and social impact assessment, which is a possible outcome because, as Kendyl had said, the other impact assessments have been much more long-lived, and so this is entirely possible that you would walk into a member organization and they would have a fully conforming environmental and social impact assessment and perhaps no or a major failing HRIA. In this case, and again, it depends on your judgment, but in this case, we think it would also result in a minor non-conformance because the company has demonstrated conformance to 2 of the requirements of criterion 2.5, and they haven't done this last piece. So in this case, there would be a minor non-conformance, which would result to a surveillance audit 12 to 18 months after the initial audit. And the third scenario that we are looking at is that there's a major failure in the HRI and also a major failure in the environmental and social impact assessments. And that sort of scenario could put you to looking at a major non-conformance. And this would lead, of course, to a provisional certification, which would give the company 1 year to put in place all of the corrective actions. So, you know, there is always, of course, your auditor judgment and interpretation, but we've tried to work out different scenarios where we take this guidance in terms of looking just at an HRIA and combine it with an environmental and social impact assessment that's required also under criterion 2.5. Now, the other situation, of course, that we might have as an outcome in ASI is that there's a critical breach. And the critical breach might be found in an HRIA if you had fraudulent representation of rights holders' engagement or involvement in serious human rights abuses. And this would prevent certification of any kind. And if you did find this in an audit, of course, you should relay it to ASI and we would look into it further. So I'll hand it back to you, Kendyl, in terms of looking through the methodologies.
Great, thank you so much, Krista. I think it's really helpful to have such clarity on how good practice in HRIA aligns to ASI standards and certification processes. And for auditors and companies that are looking to better understand human rights impact assessment, there actually is established literature out there. As I mentioned earlier, the Danish Institute for Human Rights has produced a toolbox that provides great guidance on how to conduct a human rights impact assessment, and it aligns very closely with the work that Nomogaia has done. We're frequent collaborators with Danish Institute personnel, and our methodologies and approaches share good practice. And the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has also put out very useful guidance on meaningful stakeholder engagement in recent years, and it should be seen as a resource as well. And the frameworks for these assessment processes and for ASI's guidance are on the next slide. And those are rooted in the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were unanimously endorsed by the Human Rights Council, and the OECD's Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, which actually draw language directly from the UN Guiding Principles. And for those who are particularly keen, there's additional reading and overviews on HRIA that are available on the next slide. the World Bank and Nordic Trust Fund produced an overview that was useful in 2013. James Harrison is a leading scholar and legal mind focused on human rights impact assessment. And Deanna Kemp and Frank Van Clay are two leading practitioners and experts with long ties to extractive industries based out of Australia. And there is more literature as well, so don't hesitate to reach out to Krista or me for more information. And on the next slide, we've spoken a fair bit about the full suite of human rights, but didn't necessarily clarify what those are. So the guidance on human rights impact assessment has focused on the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the ILO's 8 Core Convention on Rights at Work. And when viewed together, these documents can be summarized in this table here as a number of rights that are reinforced and restated in various of these instruments and tools. And this is just a cheat sheet. It obviously doesn't give you context on any of the rights, but if as an auditor you were looking for just a basic overview of what the full suite of human rights might look like, here's a cheat sheet. And with that, I'd really like to stop for questions. And the only other slide that we have looks through examples of HRIAs that fully conform to ASI standards, those with minor failures and those with major failures.
So one question is, how long does it take to do this? How long would it take for a company to do an adequate HRIA?
That's such a good question because it varies so greatly. I think there's a sense that a full HRIA is a daunting pursuit, but it can vary enormously. A brand new operation being erected in a Western European context with high levels of legal regulation that align with human rights can be conducted. You can have an HRIA conducted in a matter of weeks. Or even months maybe. And that probably looks more industrial, zoned into industrial area with strict environmental and social regulations and established mechanisms for protecting against corruption. Whereas if you're looking at a much larger operation, let's say a combination bauxite mine, mineral pipeline, alumina refinery, aluminum refinery, in a low governance context, that kind of assessment would be much more time consuming. You'd be looking at several months of assessment combined with many more interviews and a much deeper dive into project literature and existing project documentation and conditions for rights holders within and surrounding that operation. So there is a huge range. There are easy HRIAs, but there are also very time-intensive ones.
What does an HRIA look like in that kind of context where the infrastructure is already there, but it is a new project, and it's a significant project, but you're not in a place where you would naturally think about human rights and you don't naturally go to thinking about doing a human rights impact assessment? What does that look like?
I love that question too, because I can envision scenarios where it would look very different depending on the context. If that is a brownfield site in a low governance area where even though the area is zoned as industrial, you actually have fisher folk and agricultural communities living within the industrial zone, the human rights responsibility is to cover the full suite of rights holders. So even on that brownfield site, you would become concerned about past contamination of the soil and the water. You would become concerned about the populations that are living in the industrial zone, informally or illegally. In a context where you have a really well-managed industrial zone that is guarded at the gates and there's no chance of anyone living in it and the environmental management is strong, a full human rights impact assessment can quite quickly eliminate vast swaths of potential rights holders because there is a neighboring community, because all of the workers are unionized because all of the regulations are adhered to and the monitoring is public. So even in a brownfield site like that, there's still a real range and some opportunities to dive deep and others to see very quickly that the operation doesn't have major human rights risks.
Krista, to sharpen your question a little further, if I may, we are operating mostly in, actually, just in Western European countries and in North America. But let's take the European Union, right, where we would expand one of our rolling mills with an additional building that is for us pretty material. From an impact, maybe not as much, perhaps. The value of spending money on human rights to do that impact in a regulated country where they are expected to abide by international rules, like in the Netherlands, for example, or in Germany. Why would you expand on what is already a regulatory necessity in some of your consulting process that you need to have with within the cities or states that you live in? I'm just a little afraid for the administrative burden that might come out of this, and not as much value. Where in the times when we were Alcoa and we were opening a new mine, I can clearly see the value there, particularly in areas where there's not a very strong regulatory system. But in the Western world, what do you see? What is your experience of that? Maybe that's a better question. What is your experience in terms of outcomes of these sorts of assessments in those well-established areas?
Well, I think that the great news is that where there are literally no humans, there are no human rights. And I'm going to let Krista answer for what ASI's expectation would be in such a scenario. But an analysis where there are no people and where the entire workforce is protected under law, I could envision a scenario where the company itself could produce the evaluation to show that their human rights impacts have been identified and managed. But Krista will have a certification angle on this.
So supply chain activity-wise, this indicator or this criterion applies to all of the supply chain. So it's not limited to just primary production. So it does apply throughout, and so most of the questions we do get, Marcel, are like yours. But what I'm hearing from Kendyl is that in these situations, human rights impact assessment may just be an evaluation of whether there are human rights there, and the answer of that can feasibly be no. And so in those situations, we're not looking for you to spend to hire a huge firm and do a binder full of work, but we would be looking for you to have done that to have done that evaluation. So to have taken the list on the previous slide and say, none of these human rights are possibly going to be impacted at this site, and that if that evaluation is accurate to the situation, that would meet this criteria is what I'm getting out of this slide. You have to do that evaluation, and as an auditor, I would say always best to write it down so you can give something that really shows your thought process to the auditors versus it was a back of an envelope discussion, because it's always harder for auditors to evaluate that. It's not necessarily going to change your audit outcome. It just makes your audit process more enjoyable. But what I'm hearing from Kendyl is that can meet the requirements of 2.5 for those facilities, and that there's a huge difference between the spectrum, which is what I like to hear.
This is Mark Wilga. Could I add a comment to that?
Yes, of course.
Hi, Krista.
Hi, Mark.
So I also work with Nomogaia. And I can't speak for ASI at all, but in terms of human rights impact assessment practice, as you'll see from the list that Kendyl gave here, they're all in either medium or low governance situations. None of them are in high governance places where essentially the government makes sure human rights are protected and fulfilled. So I've never seen a valuable human rights impact assessment in a high governance area. Now, what there can be, and good practice, is for some consideration of gaps. There can be, we've had situations in very high governance operations where, for example, there are trafficked workers under modern slavery. There are situations where there are contractors who may have labor standards that are below human rights standards. And in the United States, famously, a number of business norms for labor practices fall below human rights standards. One example would be maternity leave. So there could be more, rather than a full massive human rights impact assessment, which would almost always be a waste of time and money. The good human rights due diligence practice is at least to do a check to make sure that there aren't any gaps.
And then in terms of my kind of, as I think through, so if an auditor was presented with a company presented to an auditor an assessment of the gaps, and the evaluation was that there aren't, and I was just reading one of these yesterday even. The evaluation was a mapping exercise. It was not an HRIA. It was a mapping exercise. And the outcome was that there are not a lot of rights holders at risk, but that there were some gaps. And so if I were an auditor looking at that, I would say I would evaluate that as being in conformance, because they have looked at the stakeholders, they've identified some gaps, and then they're actively working on them. Does that follow through in terms of our 5 steps? Or would you be also, if there are some gaps identified, would you be looking for the company to have reached out to do the other 4 steps next?
What I would say, this is again just Mark Wilga talking, to Marcel's question is, human rights impact assessment wasn't designed to operate in a high governance setting. Okay. It's not what it was for. So I'm not sure how ASI would treat that requirement in that setting.
Krista, I have a question, if that's okay. A lot of the impact assessments, the examples we've talked about today, part of the upstream part of the supply chain, you know, like a new mine coming on, or a major refinery that's going to be built in an area that's that will have human rights or potential for human rights impacts. Presumably this methodology can also be applied to operations downstream, you know, further downstream of the supply chain, you know, some of the manufacturing or users of aluminium in the supply chain. Would that be correct?
Yeah, human rights impact assessment can be used for any phase of the supply chain. It generally does, you know, it goes into the scoping of the human rights impact assessment, what it particularly considers, but absolutely yes. You need to have, whoever's doing the assessment needs to have participation of that phase of the supply chain and the operation.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I was wondering if we could highlight, when exactly is it that we're requiring companies to do an HRIA?
According, again, the ASI standard is for new operations or major extensions of existing operations. So that's typical for impact assessment methodology. They're usually ex ante, you know, they're forward-looking and anticipatory before a decision is made on design or implementation or construction of a project. So usually they're beforehand, and they're not usually something that's done repeatedly in the life of the project in terms of human rights impact assessment. And because they're a big deal, like most impact assessments, they only occur when there's a new project or a major change in an existing project. That's typical for impact assessment methodology. Mm-hmm. It would also apply to environmental impact assessment or social impact assessment. Somewhat different from the human rights due diligence requirements, which is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about impact assessment.
That does lead me to another question, is, so if in an audit situation you've come in and let's say The company has initiated a new project in the last year in between audits, or perhaps in the 2 years since joining ASI and their first audit. And you come in and you're doing the audit, and their HRIA doesn't meet the requirements, but they've already initiated the beginning of the project. Is it possible for the company to go back and still do an adequate HRIA, even if the new project or major change has already begun?
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
I mean, there's nothing.
Yeah.
You know, the development of human rights impact assessment was one, of impact assessment was one to be anticipatory.
Yeah.
But there's nothing in the methodology that does. So that's where you look at potential impacts that haven't occurred yet before the project is constructed. But the methodology, it's also susceptible looking at existing conditions.
Yeah.
And for a human rights impact assessment, the validity is often much higher with existing conditions because you don't have to guess.
Right. That's
You
right.
can look and measure. So it's often better. So yeah, you can clean it up.
I'm wondering if we can expand a little bit about that. I mean,
Yeah.
One of the concerns I might have, Mark, is that that it's a very company-centric at that way. If we're looking at new projects or things, and it would be considered in a kind of normal audit element. I mean, what if you have, for example, in Eritrea or whatever, you have a new government come up and there's new governmental policy that would immediately increase the risk of that. Would that also be an instance? I mean, it would seem to me, as an outsider, that would be an instance in which to possibly apply that.
Yeah, so that's a great. Yeah, I'm gonna completely agree with you. That's an instance where if you're looking at human rights due diligence, which has not been the topic of this talk, but the requirement of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights is one of knowing your human rights impacts. A change in the context would require a renewal of that due diligence. Absolutely. But the way we're talking here today, not about that, but about human rights impact assessment. And the ASI requirement is just when the project is new or where there's a significant change in the project. It doesn't address the context. So as I read the ASI requirement, no, that would not be a requirement of a new human rights impact assessment.
If the project hasn't commenced construction, so it's still in the design phase or still in the feasibility phase, and the impact assessment, so the scope of the project has changed, the impact assessment has been completed, you would expect that impact assessment to be updated to accommodate that scope change. Yes?
Yeah, that's sort of the very sad situation. Where but between the time of the years of impact assessment work and the actual no-go decision on construction, there is some major change. And that happens. There's regulatory change. There's different environmental or social changes that can occur, or economic changes. Hyperinflation would be an example.
One thing I meant to mention at the beginning of the webinar, we have developed a formal guidance document that outlines all of this. So that's posted on our website under the educational tab. So you'll find that there. And we did record this webinar, and we'll be compiling that and posting this webinar also on our website under educational, so it'll be available to everyone. If you have any questions at any further date, don't ever hesitate to reach out to myself or Sam or Kendyl directly. Thank you today to everyone who's joined us, and thank you to Kendyl and Mark for all of your work on this. Truly appreciate your time and your energy, both in the document and today on both of the webinars.